Transfiguration is one of those mysteries that I love. It has all of the wondrous special effects of God showing up in this precarious moment in the Gospel's drama. As we hear even from the collect appointed for this day, this Transfiguration mystery takes place shortly before Jesus is going to go toward his death. As the Gospel phrases it, he is about to set his face toward Jerusalem. He is about to move forward with resolution down that path which we know he's going to go toward suffering and death. There are two ways that I can imagine seeing this mystery. Two ways, one deeper than the other, and I want to explore both with you. The first way is, I think, the way that the church has traditionally interpreted the Transfiguration. That for Peter and James and John, this vision was given so that they could find courage before the sufferings of Jesus, before his cross, so that they had a hint, an intimation of what kind of son he was, what kind of God was his Father. That is the traditional way of understanding this mystery. And in a way, it makes sense to me. We want to understand that God is with us in the midst of our fears of life. And the Gospel is one of those moments, facing it, that the church wanted to know that God was God and was in charge. So, the church, I think, is facing three fears. Three fears that have always plagued us. Three fears that have always wandered into our hearts. And so this first way of seeing the Transfiguration, that I understand it, helps us to understand three powerful fears. And this vision, in some way, tries to alleviate them. Well, the first fear is that life is going to end badly. And the second fear is that we are alone. And the third fear is that life is meaningless. If you think about the kinds of fears that human beings face, just in life in general, not to mention as people of faith, those are the three big fears, at least that I can name. Life is going to end badly. You think about just the tragedies that we hear about in the news. Young lives cut short, lives filled with potential for such people, for such children in the streets. Even this weekend's funeral for Diana Pendleton. Even as we have a very recent raw memory of Newtown, Connecticut. Life ended badly for some. Life sometimes ends badly because of disease. It can end badly in failure. Life can end badly because people age. And age can remove a sense of dignity from a human being. Life can end miserably. It can end tragically, accidentally, needlessly. Life can seem like it's wasted. So yes, we've seen enough of that in our own lives. The fear that life is going to end badly is real for all of us. So the Transfiguration, in a way, seems to seep into this fear that life will end badly and says, oh no, God is there in the midst of us. There is a veil that separates God's glory from our everyday lives, but that story wants to say it's going to be okay. This second fear, again, this seems like one we can pass by if life is good. But there is this fear that we are alone. Sometimes people are just lonely. That's a fact. But sometimes as we look upon where we stand in our existence and we can say, no one's facing this with me. No one's with me. Oh yeah, I have family, I have friends, I got people I talk to, but at the end of the day, in the middle of the night, I just have me. And that's all I've got. I'm alone. And so the Transfiguration story wakes up our imagination as Christians and says, here is this vision of Jesus. And in this vision of Jesus, notice that he is not glorious by himself. He is in conversation with Moses and Elijah, with the authority of Jewish law, and with the prophetic voice that calls Israel back to God century after century. For Christians who would have thought, this Jesus experience for us is bordering on crazy. We're alone. How do we even know that this guy wasn't nuts? For as wonderful as the story is, he could have been just delusional. And in his delusion, he has seduced us into a vision of resurrection life. But what did we give up? We gave up centuries, millennia of Jewish faith and community. That is what the followers of Jesus and those few generations after them had to do. They gave up an immense treasure of spiritual life. Was this Jesus operating as a Lone Ranger? In this vision, he does not. He is acting as one who is in conversation with all the Jewish faith. He's not alone, and those who trust in him are not alone. They are in the great company of Moses and the prophets. A third fear, which this story does address, is that life is meaningless. You can always count on Peter the Apostle to say something asinine. So Peter the Apostle is kind of in this hallucinogenic stupor, trying to fall asleep and yet keeping himself awake. And here comes this vision, or who knows where from. Oh, Master, it's so great that you had this vision with us, and I'd like to make a little booth here for you, and one for Moses and one for Elijah. Not knowing what he said. People have tried for centuries to interpret what the hell he meant. But really, who knows? Did he try and preserve that sacred moment? Was he trying to honor people in a way that they cannot be honored? Was he trying to close up God in that little moment? Who knows? Regardless, he didn't know what he was talking about. He could not make meaning of that. And then as the story goes on, we know that the cross really looks meaningless. If there wasn't the story that came after the resurrection, this would be another meaningless story. Tragic, yes. Bittersweet, in that a beautiful man is put to death. But it's easy to look at that story. It's easy to look at our own lives in the face of tragedy or loss, passage of time, failure, and say, oh, it's meaningless. Now, meaninglessness, think about this, it's not just that there's no meaning that can sort of flutter down from above upon us. The real fear of meaninglessness is that we will be incapable of making meaning. If you've ever tried to figure yourself out, if you've ever spent time in a therapist's office or talking with a trusted friend or a pastor, sometimes you just realize, I don't have it in me to make meaning. And I don't know if I'm going to recover in order to make meaning. That's a profound fear. I don't know I can make anymore. I don't know, says the church. We don't know if we can make meaning anymore. So these three fears come up to us, and this final one in some ways feels the most depressing to me. We cannot make meaning. And so this story out of the cloud has Jesus' Father speaking to him. This is my Son, my beloved, my chosen one. Listen to him. At this point in the story, before Jesus sets his face toward Jerusalem, toward the cross, toward death and annihilation, toward meaninglessness, he is one we should listen to. So these three fears, on that level, are powerful for Christians. Yes, God enters in with this vision, reveals it to the church just before it gets really bad, and here our deepest fears can be addressed before it gets bad. I told you that I came up with two ways to see this. Perhaps I could have stopped here. Maybe you want me to stop here. But I had to go deeper, and here's why. Because when I look at what happened after this vision, this glorious vision, it didn't do a damn bit of good. The point of this story to me is to reveal its inadequacy in the face of the cross. Peter and James and John, they betrayed Jesus. They jockeyed for power as they were going toward Jesus' death. This hint of God's glory did them no good. It surely did the rest of the apostles no good either, because this was kept secret from everyone. They go down the mountain, stunned by the vision, and they stayed silent about it. Despite this vision, listen, the death of Jesus was a real death. It is easy to look at this vision and say, look, it was Superman all the time. He just had this skin on him that covered up who he really was. He didn't die. He didn't suffer. All of those betrayals, those jockeyings for power, they didn't affect him. Human failure doesn't bother him. He's going to win anyway. There's a tradition in the Gospels to want to see that Jesus is successful all the way through his mission. But you see, this vision, for as promising and glorious as it is, it does the church no good. And as Jesus goes towards the cross and really does die a real death, we don't know what to make of that glorious vision. In fact, we're inclined to doubt it. In the face of death, you know a dead body when you see it. But if you were half asleep anyway, that glorious vision, what was it? It was just craziness. It was just wishful thinking. You see, God may have provided a vision to Peter and James and John. And the writers might have placed this story there for us to encourage us. But in the end, you can't argue with a dead body. You can't argue with love lost and failed. You can't argue with any of that, because that's real. And if you know that that's real, and that your fears are well-founded, this vision is not going to do you much good. I also noticed this other thing, that you don't need the Transfiguration to proclaim Christ's death and resurrection. It's tempting, isn't it? It's tempting to say, oh, the glory was always there. We know how the story's going to go. The script is right there. He even warned us about it. But he still went to his death. Transfiguration, in a sense, is a well-placed spiritual trap. It is something, for the moment, seductive. We want to imagine that, oh, I'll just hang on to this bit of good news while he dies. And it still does you no good. So this vision is there, and maybe it encourages some people, maybe it helps them deal with their fears, but for me, I realize that this vision is there to seduce me with an easy answer to life's suffering and pain and death. Because even though you have the vision, in the face of suffering and death, the fears still win. They look more powerful. So when the church faces its own mortality, when we look at our own failures, they do seem more powerful than any glorious vision. But the resurrection is more powerful than that. And God is the source of that resurrection. So when we look upon this entire cycle of wondering what is going to alleviate our fears, what are we going to do in order to move forward, well, the vision may give us courage temporarily. But in the end, we're going to have to cast through the dark. We're going to have to move through, each of us, alone or as a community, move through suffering and trial, betrayal, failure, loss, meaninglessness. All of that has to be passed through so that God's glory can really be known. All of that has to be experienced by human beings who cling to Jesus. There's just no other way. Somehow,